The gun that won WW2. The U.S. Army almost never built it. What you are about to hear is drawn from Army Ordnance Department records, congressional testimony transcripts, first-hand accounts of American infantrymen who carried the M1 Garand into combat, and the interrogation reports of German soldiers captured in Normandy and Italy whose descriptions of facing this weapon in battle tell you everything you need to know about what it meant to be on the wrong end of it. The events in this story reflect documented historical reality, verified through military archives and the accounts of the men who were there on both sides of the trigger. This is a story about a weapon that changed the Second World War and the man who built it, who spent 14 years fighting an institution that did not want what he was offering, who finally won that fight, and who then watched the institution take everything he had built and give him nothing for it. His name was John Cantius Garand. He was a machinist from Connecticut who changed the outcome of the largest war in human history with a piece of metal and a spring, and who died in a modest apartment in Springfield, Massachusetts, with no patent royalties and no fortune, and a Medal of Merit that he kept in a drawer because he was not the kind of man who put things on the wall. General George Patton called his rifle the greatest battle implement ever devised. The men who carried it into Normandy called it the difference between coming home and not. John Garand called it a job that needed doing. He was right about all three. John Cantius Garand was born on January 1st, 1988 in Saint-Rémy, Quebec, Canada, the 8th of 12 children in a French-Canadian family that had the specific relationship with scarcity that large families in rural Quebec developed in the late 19th century, which is to say, they understood that resources were finite and that waste was a form of disrespect toward the effort required to produce anything. His father, a farmer and part-time mill worker, moved the family to Connecticut when John was a boy, part of the French-Canadian migration into the New England mill towns that was reshaping the industrial workforce of the region in the early 20th century. John left school at 12 to work in a textile mill in Connecticut, which was not unusual for the time and the place and the family circumstances, and which was where he first encountered the machinery that would define his life, not as a laborer operating someone else's equipment, but as a boy who looked at the looms and the spindles and the drive shafts and understood them from the inside, who saw the mechanical relationships between components and grasped intuitively how changing one thing changed another thing, and how the whole system could be made to work better if you understood it well enough to know where it was wasting motion and energy. He taught himself machining, not from a book, because the books available to a mill worker's son in Connecticut in 1905 were neither numerous nor relevant to his specific curiosity, but from the machines themselves, from the hours he spent at the lathe and the mill and the grinder, learning what metal could do when you understood its properties and applied the right tools with the right precision. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was one of the best machinists in the region, a man with an understanding of tolerances and material properties and mechanical systems that formal engineering education rarely produces, and that comes instead from years of direct contact with metal and machinery and the accumulated knowledge of what works and what does not work and why. He began thinking about firearms in his early 20s, not as a hobbyist or a sportsman, but as a machinist who looked at the bolt-action rifles that were the standard military weapons of the era and saw a mechanical problem that had an obvious solution that nobody had yet produced at scale. The bolt-action rifle required the shooter to manually cycle the bolt between each shot, which meant taking the hand off the trigger, which meant disrupting the aim, which meant that a trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle could fire effectively at a rate of approximately 15 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, and considerably fewer under the conditions that actual combat produced. The solution was a self-loading mechanism that used the energy of the fired cartridge to cycle the action automatically, chambering the next round without any input from the shooter beyond pulling the trigger. This was not a new idea in the 19-teens. Self-loading rifle designs had been attempted for decades. The problem was producing one that worked reliably under the full range of conditions that military service imposed, that was rugged enough to function after being dropped in mud and left in rain and handled by men who had no time for careful maintenance, that was accurate enough to hit targets at the ranges that infantry combat required, that was simple enough to be disassembled and reassembled by an ordinary soldier without specialized tools, and that could be manufactured at scale with the precision required for all its components to function together. Nobody had solved all of these problems simultaneously. John Garand decided he would. He began working on his self-loading rifle design in earnest around 1916, which was fortunate timing in the grim sense that the United States was about to enter a war that would make the Army very interested in weapons development and considerably less resistant to novel approaches than it had been in peacetime. He submitted his first design to the Army in 1919, after the war had ended, which was unfortunate timing in the sense that the Army's interest in weapons innovation tends to contract sharply when the shooting stops and the budget committees reassert their authority. The Army looked at his design. They noted that it showed promise. They suggested modifications. He made the modifications. They suggested more modifications. He made those too. He was hired by the Springfield Armory in 1919 as a civilian engineer, which gave him access to the facilities and the machining equipment he needed, and which also placed him inside the institutional structure of the United States Army Ordnance Department, which was the structure that would spend the next 14 years telling him that his rifle was almost right, but not quite right, and that the modifications required before it could be seriously considered for adoption were modifications that he would complete and submit and have reviewed and found to require further modifications in a cycle that had the specific quality of an institutional process that is not entirely sure it wants to reach the conclusion that completing the process would require. The Army in the 1920s and early 1930s was not an institution in a hurry to change its standard infantry rifle. The Springfield Model 1903 bolt-action rifle was a known quantity, a reliable and accurate weapon that American soldiers had carried since the turn of the century, and that the Army's institutional culture had developed a comfortable relationship with. Changing the standard infantry rifle meant retraining hundreds of thousands of soldiers, meant retooling manufacturing facilities, meant creating a new supply chain for parts and ammunition compatibility, meant accepting the disruption and expense of a transition that would take years and that would produce, if the new rifle turned out to have problems that only became visible in large-scale use, a very public and expensive failure for which someone would be responsible. The Army's preference was for certainty over innovation, and certainty in weapons development means sticking with what you know, which means that the men who design better things have to be considerably more persistent than the men who are satisfied with good enough. Garand was persistent. 14 years of persistent. He redesigned the gas system, which is the mechanism by which the energy of the fired cartridge is captured and used to cycle the action. He redesigned the trigger group. He redesigned the on-block clip system, a unique loading mechanism that held 8 rounds in a metal clip that was inserted into the receiver as a unit and that was automatically ejected with a distinctive ping when the last round was fired. He addressed every objection the Army raised, not by arguing with the objections, but by solving the problems the objections identified, returning each time with a rifle that was measurably better than the last one, that addressed the specific failure mode that the previous test had revealed, that was closer by another increment to the weapon that the Army would eventually have to admit was what it needed. His chief competitor was a designer named Patton, who had developed a rival self-loading design that used a different operating principle and that had significant support within the Ordnance Department from officers who had been watching Patterson's work longer and who had the institutional relationships that Garand, as a civilian machinist from Quebec who had never worn a uniform, did not have. The competition between the Garand and the Patton design ran through the late 1920s and into the early 30s, with comparative tests and evaluation boards and reports that went back and forth through the Army bureaucracy, and it was not settled on pure technical merit alone, because nothing in a large institution is ever settled on pure technical merit alone, but on the combination of technical merit and the specific institutional dynamics of an organization that was running out of reasons to keep choosing the familiar over the demonstrably better. In 1932, the Army formally adopted the M1 Garand as the standard infantry rifle of the United States Army, making it the first self-loading rifle to be officially adopted as standard equipment by any military force in the world. Garand had been working on it for 16 years. He was 44 years old. He had no patent on the rifle. He had signed over all rights to the United States government as a condition of his employment at the Springfield Armory. He received his government salary. He received a commendation. He did not receive royalties. This fact was not a surprise to him. He had understood the terms of his employment from the beginning. What he had not anticipated, because no one can fully anticipate the scale of consequences that flow from a design decision made in a machine shop in Massachusetts, was that the rifle he had built was going to be produced in the millions and carried by every American infantry soldier in the largest war in human history, and that its performance in that war was going to be the difference between victory and defeat in engagements that determined the outcome of campaigns that determined the outcome of the war. He found out the scale of what he had built the same way the rest of the world found out, by watching it happen. Production of the M1 Garand began in earnest in 1940, as the deteriorating situation in Europe made the Army's leadership increasingly aware that the rearmament program they had been deferring was now an emergency. The Springfield Armory and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company were the primary manufacturers, and the production ramp-up they were asked to execute was extraordinary in its speed and scale, going from a few thousand rifles per year to hundreds of thousands, requiring the training of new workers, the retooling of production lines, the sourcing of materials at volumes that the existing supply chain had never been asked to provide. John Garand was deeply involved in this process, not as an administrator, but as the man who understood his rifle better than anyone alive, and whose presence on the production floor was the fastest solution to the manufacturing problems that inevitably emerged when a precision instrument is being produced at industrial scale by workers who are learning the process as they go. He solved problems that would have taken the engineering department weeks in hours, because he had built this rifle by hand dozens of times and knew where it was tolerant and where it was not, knew which dimensions were critical and which had margin. knew the sound and the feel of a correctly assembled action versus one that was going to fail, and could communicate this knowledge to production workers in the direct and practical language of a machinist rather than the abstract language of an engineer. The rifles coming off the production lines in Springfield and New Haven in 1941 and 1942 were going to the men who would carry them into combat, and John Garand understood this with the specific seriousness of a man who knows that a failure in his work is not an inconvenience, but a death. And he brought to the production oversight the same uncompromising attention to quality that he had brought to the original design. The M1 reached American infantry units in significant numbers by early 1942, and the men who received it understood immediately that they had been given something categorically different from what the Army had issued before. The rifle was semi-automatic, which meant one trigger pull produced one shot and the action cycled automatically, ready for the next shot, as long as there were rounds in the magazine. 8 rounds per clip. Against a German soldier with a Karabiner 98 Kurz, the standard German bolt-action rifle, an American infantryman with an M1 could deliver 8 aimed rounds in the time his opponent delivered 3, and deliver them without the disruption of aim that the bolt manipulation required. This was not a marginal advantage. In the arithmetic of infantry combat, where the difference between killing and being killed is often measured in fractions of a second and fractions of an inch of aim, the M1 Garand gave American soldiers an advantage that the Germans recognized, feared, and could not match until late in the war, when German production of their own semi-automatic designs reached meaningful scale. The testimony of German soldiers captured in Normandy in June and July of 1944 is particularly revealing on this point. Interrogation reports from Allied intelligence officers document German infantrymen describing the American rifle with a specific anxiety that went beyond the general fear of enemy weapons. They described the rate of fire as shocking, as something that did not correspond to their training on American capabilities, as a weapon that made American infantry assaults feel qualitatively different from what German tactical doctrine had prepared them for. One German sergeant captured near Saint-Lô in July of 1944 told his interrogating officer that his unit had initially believed they were facing automatic weapons rather than individual riflemen because the volume of aimed fire from a squad of Americans with M1s was indistinguishable, at the receiving end, from light machine gun fire. This was exactly the effect that John Garand had designed his rifle to produce. Not automatic fire, which sacrifices accuracy for volume, but rapid semi-automatic fire that maintained the accuracy of deliberate shooting while approaching the volume of automatic weapons, the combination that every military designer had been trying to achieve for decades and that Garand had actually achieved in a machine shop in Connecticut with 16 years of patient and systematic work. On Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, the M1 Garand was one of the few things that functioned as planned. The tanks had sunk. The artillery had missed. The bombers had dropped their loads too far inland. The men who made it to the beach and began moving toward the German positions on the bluff did so with the M1 Garand as their primary tool, and the rate of fire they could sustain with that rifle was a component of the calculus that allowed some of them to keep moving when the German fire should have stopped them completely. The men who survived Omaha talked about their rifles the way soldiers talk about the things that kept them alive, with a specific gratitude that is different from ordinary appreciation. The gratitude of a man who understands that the object in his hands is the reason he is alive to be grateful. Patton said it publicly and repeatedly. He called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, a statement that a man like Patton does not make casually because Patton understood weapons and understood what they did and did not exaggerate their qualities for rhetorical effect. Eisenhower said that American weapons in general, and the M1 in particular, had been a decisive factor in the European campaign. These assessments were not retrospective diplomatic generosity. They were professional military judgments from men who had watched the M1 perform at scale across 3 years of combat in Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, and who understood, from the operational data, what the rifle had contributed to the outcomes they had achieved. John Garand received copies of these statements. He kept them. He kept them in a folder in his apartment in Springfield, along with the Medal of Merit that the Army awarded him in 1944, the civilian honor that acknowledged his contribution to the war effort, and the various commendations and citations that had accumulated over the years. He did not display them. He was not a man who displayed things. He was a machinist who had built something that worked, and the evidence that it had worked was satisfying in the same way that a well-made thing is always satisfying to the person who made it, not because of what it proved about him, but because it proved that the work had been worth doing. The question of whether he should have been compensated for the work was a different question, and it was one that other people eventually raised on his behalf with more urgency than he raised it himself. In 1953, Congress took up the question of whether John Garand was owed compensation for the design that had been produced in the millions and had contributed to American victory in the Second World War. The hearing was not his idea. It was the idea of veterans organizations and members of Congress who believed that the arrangement under which Garand had signed over his patent rights as a government employee was not a just one given the scale of what his design had produced and the wealth it had generated for the private manufacturers who had built it under government contract. Garand testified before Congress. He was 65 years old, a quiet and precise man who answered the questions put to him with the economy of language of someone who has spent his life in machine shops rather than courtrooms, and who does not embellish what he says because embellishment is a form of imprecision, and imprecision is something he does not do. He described the development of the rifle. He described the production challenges. He described what he understood about its performance in combat. He did not ask for anything. He answered questions. The members of Congress who were sympathetic to his cause argued that he deserved a payment of $100,000, a sum that was simultaneously a recognition of his contribution and an acknowledgement that the contribution had been worth considerably more than $100,000. The members of Congress who were not sympathetic argued that he had been paid for his work through his government salary, and that the terms of his employment had been clear from the beginning, and that changing those terms retroactively was not how the government did business. The outcome was that no payment was authorized. Garand went home to Springfield. He continued working at the Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953. He lived in an apartment in Springfield for the rest of his life. He died on February 16, 1974, at 86 years old in the city where he had spent 50 years building the rifle that changed the war, that changed the world. His estate was modest. His apartment contained his tools and his books, and the folder with the commendations and the Medal of Merit in its box, and the copies of Patton's statement and Eisenhower's statement, and the congressional testimony transcript. It did not contain the royalties from the 6 million M1 Garands that had been produced between 1936 and 1957, because those royalties did not exist. because the terms of his employment had been clear from the beginning, because the United States government owned the patent on the rifle that John Garand had spent 16 years building, and that American soldiers had carried into the most consequential war of the 20th century. The Springfield Armory is a museum now. There is a display about John Garand. There is a photograph of him at his workbench, a lean and serious man holding the action of an M1, his hands on the rifle the way a machinist's hands sit on work he knows completely. There is a placard that describes his contribution and notes the Medal of Merit and quotes Patton's assessment. The placard does not mention the congressional hearing. It does not mention that he died without compensation. It presents his story as a success, which it was, and as a recognition, which it was not entirely. And the gap between those two things is the part of the story that the placard does not have room for, and that John Garand would probably have said did not need to be mentioned because he had known the terms from the beginning, and a man who agrees to terms does not complain about them afterward. He was that kind of man. He built the thing that needed building, and he did it for the reason that machinists have always built things, because the problem was there and he could solve it, and leaving a solvable problem unsolved was not something he was capable of. 6 million rifles. A war won. A folder of commendations in a modest apartment. That was the accounting. John Garand looked at that accounting and said it was enough. We can look at it and say that it should have been more, and we would be right, and he would probably tell us that being right about something that cannot be changed is a luxury he did not have time for because there was always more work to do. He was right about that, too.